Hi, I'm Dave Van Oss, Agricultural Markets Manager for Libro Credit Union. Libro is very excited to be this year's presenting sponsor for the virtual Outdoor Farm Show. We truly hope that your farm business finds great value with this upcoming session.
Hi, I'm Laura Rance, Vice President of Content for Glacier Farm Media. The fact that you're attending an outdoor farm show indoors, watching on your computer screen, is just one illustration of how disruptive and how life-changing the COVID-19 pandemic has been for all of us. As Canada's Outdoor Farm Show pivoted to Canada's Digital Farm Show, we decided we wanted to take a closer look at how it has affected food and agriculture in Canada and around the world. So we've reached out to a variety of analysts to get their take on things 6 months into a phenomenon that's likely to have long-lasting effects. Today, I'm having a conversation with two executives who have built their careers around marketing in agriculture and food. And it's a space, I have to say, that's become increasingly complicated even before the pandemic hit. Joining me now is Len Kahn, President and Strategist for Kahntact Marketing, and Jo-Ann McArthur, who is President and Chief Strategist for Nourish Food Marketing. Hi to both of you, and thanks for joining us at Canada's Digital Farm Show.
Hey, Laura.
Pleasure. Hard to believe it's been 6 months we've been at this COVID thing.
It really is 6 months, and I had to count it out on my fingers this morning. Looking back, when you look back to where we were in February and even before that, I mean, we probably could have and should have anticipated something like this happening at some point in time, but it took us all by surprise, I think. And I just wanted to get your perspective on what surprised you most about how it affected our food system as things started to unfold.
I think, to your point, should we have been surprised? Perhaps not, but certainly the scale of it, I don't think anybody could have predicted this. And anybody who says they can, I want to give them money to invest for me. But I guess one of the biggest surprises, and it shouldn't have been, is we've become really efficient in how we produce and manufacture food. And by being so efficient, we've gotten rid of any sort of cushion. It's very much a just-in-time model. And I think because of that, our resiliency probably wasn't as strong as we thought. I think the other thing that this crisis has done is it was like there was this whole curtain in between the consumer, the customer, and the actual food system. And that's fallen now. That wasn't a surprise. We've seen from CCFI's research that consumers really don't understand the food system. But I think for the first time, they're starting to read about it. They're starting to ask questions. And, they're starting to understand that distribution systems are different for retailers versus food service. And they're also starting to look at, conditions and how our food's grown, harvested, and produced. And that, I think, will be a lasting effect of this crisis.
Len, what did you see? What took you aback when you saw this start to happen?
Well, I'm going to go a slightly different way. I have to say I was pleasantly surprised by how well the primary ag sector has handled the current crisis. And it's not to downplay the effects and say there weren't any, but by and large, crops got in the ground this spring, cows got milked, chickens got fed, and in general, the industry was able to proceed. Farmers are used to shocks and crises, in the livestock sector, BSE and PRRS, trade wars with China, interest rate spikes. So in many ways, ag, not that anyone was prepared for a pandemic, but in many ways, ag has been through this before. And so I would say that was a pleasant surprise. I guess I was surprised a little bit, and I should know better being in the industry, but how quickly shocks on the consumer side can affect primary agriculture. So one thing I never would have thought of was French fries. So when restaurants started to close, demand for French fries dropped rapidly, and there were some pretty serious effects on potato producers in the Maritimes and across Canada. And that happened almost suddenly because you're coming out of last year with potatoes in storage, and they were backing up, and now it's planting season. So just how interconnected the food system is, this really pointed that out to me as well.
There was a really striking sense of vulnerability, I think, from the consumer's perspective. I mean, I think for the first time in a generation, probably since the war years, we had people going to the grocery store and not being able to find anything and everything that they wanted in huge quantities. I mean, there was actually visibly empty shelves at some point. What kind of impact do you think that shock has to a generation of consumers?
Yeah, I mean, it was the share of stomach, the pivot overnight was incredible, because prior to this, we were eating, we were summoning our meal more than half the time from out of home, right? Whether that was delivery, takeout, eating in a restaurant. And overnight, that basically went to almost zero. And, you know, to Len's point, the food system did a great job in distribution in terms of pivoting to try to do that and to keep those shelves going. But, you know, we've never seen those kind of shortages. We track consumer behavior, and the consumers started to Google food supply and food systems and words that they never would have used. And we saw all sorts of, you know, bizarre behavior. You know, that sort of, let's stock up the toilet paper, and then it moved to flour and this and that. But there is going to be long term. I mean, food service is not going to come back to exactly the way it was. And certainly, you know, traffic patterns are changing. There's an incredible survey of just over 11,000 Canadians at the end of July. And 42% of Canadians say that a year from now, they don't know what they're going to be doing or where they're going to be living. Like, that's unprecedented, right? In terms of uncertainty. So you're trying to deal with that, but consumers are cooking at home because they have to. They have time. If they've got kids, it's a way to keep kids going. So, you know, I guess we've seen some different behavior throughout the pandemic. So at the start of the pandemic, there was, you know, a real hit on comfort foods. You know, there's that saying, in extraordinary times, we reach for the ordinary. So we saw, you know, sales of meat up and snacks and the quarantini, so alcohol up to sort of signal the end of the day, help us deal with stress. But now that we're 6 months in, it's summer, we're starting to see consumers refocus on health, and especially immunity. You know, as a way of dealing with the fact that COVID could be with us for a while. So there's a real focus on more fresh food, but also because we were doing shopping missions, like going out and shopping once every couple of weeks, there's this huge focus on food waste as well. So we do an annual trend report, and our 2020 trend report came out in November. Things have changed. But what this crisis has done in some cases, it's like gasoline on a fire. It's become an accelerant. And while food waste was top of mind beforehand, it's become even more so, because consumers, you know, they're only buying so much food, and they're really trying to make that all really work.
I was just going to say, just to build on something Jo-Ann said, I was sitting in a webinar yesterday, which I very rarely done before. I used to sign up for them and not show up, but now I have to. So this was Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, and the presenter was Grassroots Public Affairs. And they had one really compelling slide. So 65% of consumers say availability of food got worse. Like, they were saying, what got worse? And the biggest trigger was availability. 32% said price, 21% said quality. So I have never known hunger. My father and his family emigrated in 1939. They didn't starve, but they knew hunger. And I think everyone beyond that, my kids would just laugh. But all of a sudden, when you see bare grocery store shelves, that's something, we've never seen before. And that was a bit of a shock. And related to that, I think, was all of a sudden this focus on logistics and distribution. These are things we tend not to talk about. We complain because we get stuck behind a slow truck on the 401. Now we realize that that truck has the food that's going to the grocery store. So I think it's just been a whole awakening. And I think in the long term, that's going to be a positive if we don't squander the opportunity.
I think you've both mentioned just the reliance that our sector has on just in time and the really remarkable efficiency that we've been able to put into our food system, and yet you mentioned, Jo-Ann, the word resiliency, and to some extent it's come at the expense of resiliency, and we saw how that trickled back to the producer level very, very quickly because of disruptions in meat packing, for example, where producers had no place to market and consumers were actually finding that they couldn't buy some of the product that they were looking for. So what do we do with that kind of equation in a post-pandemic scenario, knowing that we're still in this for the long haul? But what do you see the industry looking to as far as trying to build some resiliency into the supply chain while maintaining a high degree of efficiency, which we've all become to rely on? I know that's a long-winded question.
It's food security. And I think part of food security is this movement that was happening before, and I think will be on steroids coming out of this, which is supporting our own producers, right? So the whole trend to local, buying Canadian, that has been a trend for a while, especially in times of crisis. If you look at like 2008, the recession, that was sort of the resurgence for farmers markets. And that was because people wanted to support their neighbor, whether they knew them or not, right? There's this sense of community coming out of that. I think that will be a long-term impact of this. We will want to know more about, there's a new appreciation for farmers and people who get the food on the shelf and on our plate. And we're going to want to support our own producers and manufacturers. And, to Len's point, a crisis, let's not waste this opportunity to do something. And, the government's been talking about supporting value-added ag, about supporting things with a Buy Canadian, and really pushing that. And I'm starting to see movement on that front, which I think is really exciting. But, we need to keep that momentum going. The other thing I'll say to that point is what we've seen in this crisis. It's important to remember that there's two Canadas coming out of this. So you've got about half of Canadians who are actually in some ways better off financially because they don't have childcare costs, they don't have commuting costs. Their discretionary income's up because they're not eating out, they're not able to really travel. So those people have more discretionary income. So they're going to be well placed for more specialty goods. They'll have the resiliency as prices go up, which they will. But then you've got other Canadians who are using food banks, who largely are in the hospitality sector, who are just trying to make rent. And it's good to see the government also starting to come forward with programs. To Len's point about potatoes, for instance, a lot of things, weeks supply were being, thrown out. And now the government's trying to get things in place to get the food that's needed to the people in need.
Correct.
I think it's really interesting how short our memories will be. So I'm having a pretty good debate with my, I did a master's in ag econ at University of Guelph, and my supervisor was Dr. Carl Melke. And I put something out that said, hey, maybe this bigger is better is an assumption that will get challenged coming out of this. So there's no doubt from an economic point of view that bigger is better. A 10,000 acre farm is more efficient than 1,000. Huge packing plants are more efficient than smaller ones. But it's only now that you see how vulnerable you are if there's a large chunk of an area's meat supply that relies on one plant. If that plant shuts down, that has immediate and large impacts. Will we be willing to pay a little bit more, A, to buy Canadian, as Jo-Ann said, or buy local, and B, to back off from this bigger is better trend? Carl says no way. He said money rules. I wonder a little bit, and there's no definitive answer, but we'll see.
I think I weigh in on Carl a little bit because through this bigger has been better on some fronts. So in terms of manufacturers, they've been the ones who've been able to add the third bigger sizes, and they're the ones supplying the supermarkets. And the smaller farm producers, they were the ones that in some places were supplying food service, those restaurateurs. And so those small to medium farmers have had to pivot and find a new marketplace. So, and I do think with meat packing, it's going to be the big guys who can make the capital investment in robotics and automation that down the road is going to be potentially a little safer.
I think there's a new dynamic at play here than what we've seen in the past, and that's the opportunity for online marketing and delivery. And we've seen a tremendous uptake from what I'm hearing in the number of consumers that are buying direct from a farmer. It's almost like they want their own farmer. And I'm just wondering how that's going to play into this, because when you have an opportunity to go online and order food, is there a likelihood that there's an opportunity for the smaller suppliers to actually come out of this and build a viable business?
Well, I'll go the other way and talk about agriculture in that context. I think it's a great question. One of the things that's emerged from this crisis is, because we're hunkered down, the lack of broadband, high-speed internet in rural areas has come to the forefront, I think. Right. And I don't have numbers in front of me to quantify it, but I know enough people in the industry. We assume it. Here in Guelph, we get a little angry if we're a little slow one day. There's whole areas of the rural economy that are not served. But what you are starting to see is what would have been called heresy up till now. So companies springing up to actually do online ordering of inputs and supplies with delivery. And that has always been kind of the third rail in ag because of the key role that retailers have. And I still think retailers have a key role, but I think the functionality coming out of this could change more rapidly. I can see the government investing more quickly and heavily in rural broadband, and I can see supply chains changing because of that. And therefore, retailers are going to have to find ways to add value using their brains, not just their warehouses.
Yeah, I think one of the things consumers want to put a face on the people who grow their food. And so, we've seen the rise in CSA boxes, and a lot of those small farms who were supplying the local restaurateur have had to find somebody else. That being said, the consumer is not going to be taking a mushroom delivery, a fish delivery, this delivery. So, if there is a way to tie in together and have that box, kind of that, call it a meal kit 3.0. I think that could have some long-term legs. We're certainly, in terms of online groceries, what I think is the center of the store is what's going to go, traditionally has gone online the fastest. So your staples, like, toilet paper and things like that. But consumers really do like to shop. Right. That's there's that love of going out and discovering, especially the perimeter of the store, which is all the fresh produce and proteins. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon.
Do you see the kind of shock that we've had to the system in the last little while as being something that is accelerating existing trends, or is it actually a paradigm shift?
I think in a lot of cases it's accelerating. And so we talked about one of our trends was Save Me, which was, eating based on planet impact and actually looking at the way food was made. Right. And I think with this crisis, that's accelerating it, right? Consumers, are looking at how food is raised. I was shocked at how few people knew about our use of temporary foreign workers. Yeah. They now understand that. They now understand the conditions. And that's becoming a real hot button. Before it was how do you treat your animals? It's expanded now to how do you treat your labor? And also even frontline workers in grocery stores, living wage discussions, full-time employment, benefits, citizenship. Like this is, worker conditions. These things are broadening. And, just like we've seen the rise of fair trade for products that are produced outside of North America, I'm starting to see bubble up in the US, and I think it will come here potentially, is this rise in social justice marks. So we may get something that a seal here that says, this has been not only have The resources and the animals been treated well and fairly, but so have the workers here. I think this crisis, it's causing us not just to look at our food system, but it's causing us to look at everything, right? You've seen the rise in Black Lives Matter, and equity, and it's just, we've been shaken to our core. And so as a result, we're taking a look at everything.
Len, how do you think that is going to trickle back to the people on the land? I mean, they're very much at the front lines of production, but how are these ideas or these trends going to trickle back?
I think that's a good question, and as Jo-Ann said earlier, I think if I knew that, I would invest in the stock market in those sectors. I tend to agree with what Jo-Ann said. I think the last 6 months have accelerated a bunch of trends that were already out there. I think one of the big opportunities that we as the primary ag industry can take advantage of is consumers are more interested in and engaged in their food system, and we haven't always been clear that's a good thing, because the knowledge base, the distance from the farm makes these somewhat high-risk conversations. But for better or for worse, we're in it now, and as an industry, so I look at groups like Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. And interestingly, one other effect, I'll do a little bunny trail, is I think we've all had a little more time and we've been able to slow down. Right. And there was a cool new website resource that was launched. It's called utensil.ca, and it was incubated by Andrew Campbell, the fresh air farmer, and Crystal Mackay. And it's kind of a primer about everything to know about ag and food, right down to the terminology. So I think if we're willing to engage, but that's going to be a change in the countryside, because farmers tend to be private. They're worried about activists, and so they're worried about engagement. So I'm interested to see if that does change, or if we have this short memory, if in a year we have a vaccine and life has gone back to normal, whether we forget all this like a bad dream or we learn and get better because of it.
That's my sense too, is that farmers are a little bit reluctant to have that sense of someone looking over their shoulder. They want consumers to trust what they're doing, and yet they're a little bit nervous when people start asking too many questions. But is that something that you see changing with organizations such as the Center for Food Integrity? I mean, do you see some movement forward in that area?
Yeah, I have. They've actually launched a campaign recently that we were prayerfully involved with called It's Good Canada. And there was lots of debates behind the scene about, is this a good idea and how far do we go? And, since I've known Jo-Ann, it's one of the things that she's always pushed me on about, what's wrong with your industry? Like, there's such a good story. Why don't we talk about it? And there's reasons why we don't. But I do believe that, I think, for example, Center for Food Integrity is kind of an integrator for all parts of the food system, and that's their kind of unique point. And I do see them continuing with this, and maybe you may even see some government support for things like that. So I don't think there's any turning back now, Laura, and it's not going to be for every farmer, but farm groups, individual farmers who are comfortable doing it. I do think this is something that's going to come out of this more forcefully than ever.
What gives you hope in this scenario? We've had lots of bad news over the last 6 months, but what encourages you about what you see happening perhaps on the horizon, or the potential that's there? Jo-Ann, let's start with you.
I think we're finally going to take action on tooting our own horn, right? Brand Canada is a great brand. We've got amazing resources. We have amazing farmers and producers in this country, and we haven't talked about it a lot. We've been typically Canadian. So I think this is a chance to be a little proud and talk about what's best about us. I think it also is going to nudge us in terms of some more added value ag as well. In a lot of cases, we raise the inputs, we ship them over to Asia, and then we import them back as finished goods. Right. And I think part of being food secure is developing that capability within our own borders. And so I'm hopeful that will finally, this will be the tipping point for that to happen, hopefully with a little bit of a nudge and support from the government.
Len, I'll give the last word to you.
Oh, wow. I'm hopeful about two things, maybe, that the current crisis, maybe because we've had the chance to slow down and think, and has shone some light on some what were maybe underground issues. So mental health is a big thing. So yes, farmers were able to get the crop in the ground, milk the cows. Farming at its core is a bit of a solitary activity. But as you know, the farming community is hugely social. So even the trade shows, right? Trade shows, I was working at Ginty Jokes and Associates when the Outdoor Farm Show was conceptualized, and he did a lot of research. And the most compelling reason farmers go to trade shows is social. Yes, there's a business component. So I think mental health has taken a hit, and it's an unseen hit. And there is some talk about it, but I think there'll be more. Shining a light on not only the role that migrant farm workers play, but how they're treated. You know, out of sight, out of mind, not good. And also, okay, I'll maybe agree with Jo-Ann and Carl that I don't really think the consolidation and bigger is better trend is going backwards necessarily, but how do we ensure worker safety in those plants, that kind of thing. And the second thing, and this is me really being hopeful, Laura, is our industry in ag has done a horrible job of cooperating with each other. So primary producers are at war with processors, are at war with retailers. Maybe war is too strong a word, but there's that. And it's all about margin and money. But I think we've seen here that hanging together is not only good for the industry, but it's probably more profitable, and it does set us up better, in a better way to handle future shocks. So I'm hopeful that that'll happen. I'd say my confidence level is a little lower than my hopeful level, but let's see.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I'd love to have another hour to keep going, but I just wanted to say thank you to Jo-Ann McArthur and to Len Kahn for joining us at Canada's Digital Farm Show, and I hope we can talk again in the future.
Thanks, Laura.
My pleasure. Thanks.